If you had walked through the streets of London on May 8, 1945, you would have seen something extraordinary. Church bells rang across the city. Flags hung from every window. Crowds packed Trafalgar Square, waving Union Jacks until their arms ached. Britain had just won the greatest war in human history. The Nazi regime was crushed. The British Empire still painted a quarter of the world map red. Victory was complete. But here's what the history books won't tell you. Britain didn't survive that victory. The country that entered the war as the world's banker exited as the world's beggar. The empire didn't fall because of military defeat. It fell because the treasury was empty. The vaults were bare. The gold was gone. This is not a story about battles. This is a story about bankruptcy. Let me show you how the greatest empire in modern history was dismantled not by enemy soldiers, but by accountants in Washington and bankers on Wall Street. This is the story of how Britain won the war and lost everything else. Before 1939, Britain was not just a country. It was a financial ecosystem that covered the globe. London was the beating heart of world finance. The pound sterling was the currency that mattered. From Bombay to Cairo, from Sydney to Cape Town, trade was conducted in British pounds. Money flowed into London like rivers feeding an ocean. And from there, it was redistributed across an empire that spanned every continent. This wasn't just about having colonies. It was about owning the system. British banks financed railways in Argentina. British investors owned mines in South Africa. British insurance companies backed ships on every ocean. The City of London was not just wealthy. It was the wealth, the mechanism, the engine of global capital. This financial dominance gave Britain power that went far beyond the size of its island. The Royal Navy was the largest in the world because London could afford it. Britain could run trade deficits because everyone needed pounds to do business. The empire could punch above its weight because it controlled the ledger. But empires built on credit have a fatal weakness. They can only survive as long as the credit holds. Then came September 1939. Germany invaded Poland. Britain declared war. And the clock started ticking on the empire's bankruptcy. To fight a modern industrial war, you need three things: steel, oil, and cash. Britain had some steel. It had access to oil through the empire. But it did not have enough cash. Not nearly enough. Think about the scale of what was required. Entire armies had to be equipped from scratch. The Royal Air Force needed thousands of planes. The Navy needed destroyers to hunt submarines. Factories had to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And here's the problem. Britain was an island under siege. It couldn't feed itself. It couldn't fuel itself. Everything had to be imported. Wheat from Canada, oil from the Middle East, steel from America, and all of it had to be paid for. In the first year of the war alone, Britain spent more than it had spent in the previous decade. The reserves began to drain. By 1940, France had fallen. Britain stood alone against the Nazi war machine. Churchill gave his famous speeches about fighting on the beaches. But behind closed doors, he was facing a different enemy: insolvency. The Treasury sent him a memo in December 1940. The message was blunt. Britain had enough dollars to last 6 more weeks. 6 weeks. After that, the country would be unable to pay for food or weapons. Churchill sent a secret letter to President Roosevelt. It was not a letter between equals. It was a plea. Britain needed help. It needed credit. It needed America to keep the supplies flowing, or the war was over. Roosevelt understood the leverage he had. America was the only country with the industrial capacity and the financial resources to save Britain, and he intended to use that leverage to reshape the world. The solution was called Lend-Lease. On the surface, it sounded generous. America would lend Britain weapons, food, and oil for the duration of the war. Britain would pay later, or return the equipment when the war was over. Roosevelt called it lending your neighbor a garden hose when his house is on fire. But this was not charity. This was a transaction. Buried in the Lend-Lease agreements were clauses that would dismantle the British Empire's economic foundation. The Americans demanded that Britain commit to ending imperial preference. This was the trade system that gave British goods favorable treatment across the empire. It was the glue that held the economic bloc together. America wanted that glue dissolved. They wanted access to the markets of India, Africa, and Australia. They wanted the British Empire to stop being a closed shop. There was another clause. Britain had to liquidate its foreign assets before receiving American aid. This was devastating. Britain owned investments all over the world. Railways in South America, plantations in Asia, stock portfolios in New York. These assets had been built up over generations. They were the foundation of Britain's wealth. America demanded they be sold immediately, so Britain sold. It sold its stake in American Viscose for $40 million. It sold its holdings in Courtaulds. It liquidated investments in Argentine railways that British engineers had built in the 19th century. The gold reserves in the Bank of England were crated up and shipped across the Atlantic. By 1941, Britain had transferred over $4 billion in assets to America, and still it wasn't enough. But the most shocking part of Britain's wartime financing was not what it borrowed from America. It was what it borrowed from its own empire. This chapter is rarely taught in schools. It's known as the sterling balances, and it was a form of legalized theft on a scale never seen before. To fight the war in Asia and North Africa, Britain needed supplies. It needed food, uniforms, ammunition, and raw materials. Much of this was sourced from India, but Britain didn't have the money to pay for it. So the colonial government devised a system. When a British officer in Delhi bought rice or steel, he paid in rupees. But where did those rupees come from? They were printed, freshly printed by the Reserve Bank of India under British control. In exchange for these printed rupees, the British government in London deposited an IOU in a bank account. This account was held in London. It was denominated in pounds, and it could not be accessed. India was effectively giving Britain an unlimited loan. On paper, India's sterling balance grew to over £1.3 billion. In today's money, that's roughly $45 billion. But here's what that really meant. The money supply in India exploded. Prices skyrocketed. Inflation ravaged the poorest communities. In Bengal, the price of rice tripled in less than 2 years. Farmers couldn't afford to buy back the grain they had grown. This was not an accident. This was policy. And it led directly to the Bengal famine of 1943. Over 3 million people starved to death. Britain was financing its war by inflating the currency of its starving subjects, and the plan was simple. Win the war. Rebuild the economy. Pay India back later? Maybe. By 1945, the war was over. Germany was defeated. Japan had surrendered, Britain stood on the winning side, but the bill had arrived. Britain owed money to America. It owed money to Canada. It owed money to India, Egypt, and a dozen other colonies. The total debt was £21 billion, 3 times the size of Britain's entire annual economic output. The country was technically insolvent, but British politicians believed the worst was over. They assumed that Lend-Lease would continue during the Reconstruction period. The country needed time to rebuild. Factories had to be retooled. Housing had to be constructed. Rationing was still in place. There was no bread. There was no coal. But surely America would help its ally recover. Then came the shock. On August 21, 1945, 6 days after Japan surrendered, President Truman signed an executive order. Lend-Lease was terminated, immediately, without warning. Ships that were already at sea carrying food and fuel to Britain were ordered to turn around, unless Britain could pay in cash. Britain had no cash and had no dollars. The Treasury was empty. The British government panicked. They sent a delegation to Washington, led by the economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynes was a brilliant man. He had spent the war years trying to design a post-war financial system that would allow Britain to survive. But he was exhausted, he was sick, and he was about to lose the most important negotiation of his life. Keynes arrived in Washington hoping for a grant, a gift from one ally to another, a recognition of Britain's sacrifice. The American negotiators said no. There would be no gift. There would be a loan, and the loan would come with conditions, brutal conditions. The chief American negotiator was a man named Harry Dexter White. He was cold. He was calculating. And he knew Britain had no leverage. The loan was set at $3.75 billion. It was the largest loan America had ever issued. But the interest rate was 2%. Britain would have to start repaying in 1951, and there were 2 conditions that would cripple the British economy for decades. Condition 1. Britain had to make the pound sterling convertible within 1 year. This meant that anyone holding British pounds could demand to exchange them for U.S. dollars at a fixed rate. Keynes knew this was a trap. He knew that every country in the world wanted dollars to buy American goods. If Britain made the pound convertible, there would be a run on sterling. The reserves would be drained in weeks. Condition 2. Britain had dismantled the imperial preference system. Immediately, the Americans wanted the empire's markets opened to American exports. They wanted the trade barriers torn down. They wanted Britain to stop protecting its economic bloc. This was not just about economics. This was about power. America was using Britain's desperation to pry open the empire and walk through the door. Keynes fought. He argued. He warned that Britain was too weak to survive convertibility. But the Americans were immovable. They held all the cards. Britain was starving. Britain was freezing. Britain had no choice. In December 1945, the Anglo-American loan agreement was signed. Britain took the money and signed its own execution warrant as a global power. The crisis came exactly as Keynes predicted. On July 15, 1947, Britain made the pound convertible, as required by the loan agreement. Within days, the floodgates opened. Countries across the world rushed to exchange their pounds for dollars. Egypt dumped pounds. Australia sold pounds. Every nation that had been forced to hold sterling during the war now wanted out. They wanted dollars. They wanted stability. Britain's foreign reserves hemorrhaged. In the first week, £100 million drained out. In the second week, another £100 million. The Bank of England was bleeding to death. The government watched in horror as the entire loan evaporated. After just 5 weeks, the Chancellor of the Exchequer suspended convertibility, but the damage was catastrophic. Confidence in sterling was destroyed. The world had seen that Britain could not defend its currency. The illusion of British financial power evaporated in a single month. From that moment on, every British government was haunted by one fear: a run on the pound. Every budget, every policy, every decision was made with one eye on the currency markets. Britain was no longer a free actor. It was a prisoner of its creditors, and the empire itself was now a luxury Britain could not afford. Maintaining colonial administrations cost money. Garrisoning troops in Palestine, Malaya, and Kenya cost money. Suppressing independence movements cost money. Britain had none. The colonies were no longer assets. They were liabilities. Cost on a balance sheet that was already drowning in red ink. India was the first to go, the jewel in the crown. Britain owed India over £1 billion in those sterling balances. It could not pay. It could not afford to police the growing tensions between Hindus and Muslims. It could not afford to administer a subcontinent of 400 million people. So in 1947, Britain left. Not gracefully, not after careful planning, but in chaos. India was partitioned. Millions were displaced. Hundreds of thousands were killed. Britain fled. Palestine was abandoned the following year. The British mandate ended, and the region collapsed into war. Burma was granted independence. Ceylon followed. Across Africa and Asia, the same pattern repeated. Britain did not leave because of military defeat. It left because it was broke. The empire was liquidated like a bankrupt company selling off assets to pay its debts. By 1950, Britain had stabilized at a lower level. The immediate threat of starvation had passed, but the economy was stuck in a trap called stop-go. Whenever the government tried to stimulate growth, imports would surge. British goods were uncompetitive, so people bought German cars and American washing machines. Money flowed out. The pound weakened. To save the currency, the government would raise interest rates and cut spending. Growth would stop. The cycle repeated itself every 2 years. Britain could not grow without going broke. But the political elite refused to accept reality. They still believed Britain was a great power. They still believed the country could act independently on the world stage. That delusion died in the sands of Egypt in 1956. The Suez Canal was the lifeline of what remained of British influence. It connected Britain to the oil fields of the Middle East and the trade routes to Asia. When Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the canal, British Prime Minister Anthony Eden saw it as an existential threat. He conspired with France and Israel to launch a secret invasion. The plan was for Israel to attack Egypt. Then Britain and France would intervene as peacekeepers and seize the canal. Militarily, the operation succeeded. British paratroopers secured the canal zone. The Egyptian army retreated. But the battle was not won on the battlefield. It was lost in the financial markets. President Eisenhower was furious. He had not been consulted. He saw the invasion as a reckless throwback to colonialism, and he had the power to stop it, not with soldiers, but with currency. The U.S. Treasury began selling pounds on the open market. The value of sterling collapsed. At the same time, Britain needed emergency funds from the International Monetary Fund to stabilize the currency. Eisenhower picked up the phone. He told the IMF to refuse the request. Then he called Eden. The message was clear. Withdraw your troops, or we will destroy your economy. Britain's gold reserves were draining at a catastrophic pace. Bankruptcy was days away. Anthony Eden had no choice. He ordered a ceasefire. British troops withdrew in humiliation. Suez shattered the illusion. The world saw the truth. Britain could not act without American approval. Its military existed on American credit. Sovereignty depends on solvency, and Britain was not solvent. The 1960s looked vibrant on the surface. The Beatles, swinging London. But economically, it was an era of managed decline. The empire unraveled piece by piece. The Union Jack came down in Lagos, Nairobi, Kuala Lumpur. Britain joined the European Economic Community not as a leader, but as a supplicant. The pound became a permanent crisis. Fixed at $2.80, it was wildly overvalued. Exports collapsed. Deficits widened. Speculators circled. Prime Minister Harold Wilson fought for 3 years to defend the rate-cutting spending, freezing wages, borrowing abroad. In November 1967, he lost. The reserves were gone. The pound was devalued to $2.40. That night, Wilson went on television and told the public their pound had not been devalued. It was a lie. Prices rose immediately. People understood their leaders were not just powerless but dishonest about it. The 1970s delivered the final blow. Inflation hit 25%. Strikes shut the country down. Britain became the sick man of Europe. By 1976, the markets refused to lend. The pound collapsed. Dennis Healey turned his car around and called the IMF. Britain was out of credit and out of time. This was humiliation beyond words. The IMF was meant for collapsing economies in Africa and Latin America, not Britain, the nation that once ruled a quarter of the world. Yet Britain had no choice. IMF officials arrived in London, opened the books, and imposed terms. Brutal spending cuts, asset sales, and the end of subsidies. Britain accepted a $3.9 billion loan, the largest in IMF history. The 1976 crisis marked the bottom. It was the moment Britain accepted it was no longer an empire, just another country. Financial dominance was gone, but from that humiliation came adaptation. In 1979, Margaret Thatcher rose with a radical insight. Land no longer created power, capital did. In 1986, the Big Bang deregulated finance. London opened to American, Japanese, and European banks, transforming itself into the capital of a new invisible empire. Britain learned that if it could not rule with battleships, it could rule with balance sheets. Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, Bermuda, tiny territories became vaults for global wealth, all connected through London. Britain became globalization's middleman. The irony is sharp. America dismantled Britain's empire and currency power, but Britain survived as a junior partner, smaller, but profitable. Empires do not fall in a day. They bleed out over decades. History belongs to creditors. Follow the money. It never lies. Subscribe now and stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw the real story, the story that accountants tell, the story written in ledgers, not in marble. The story of how Britain lost the world without losing a war.